Hello, U.S. government students. It is Monday. It is later than I expected it to be on Monday, but it is Monday. It's still daylight, and I've got some questions for you. Now, I'd like you to take down these questions and answer them utilizing my thoughts, but also your own thoughts. So don't make them devoid of either what I have to offer, but also don't just be slavish to answer what you think I need to hear. So here are the questions. Number one, what are executive orders and what limits their use and power? Number two, does the impeachment process work effectively in American politics like the founders imagined? Does the impeachment process work effectively in American politics like the founders imagined? Number three, quick one, not a lengthy question or answer. Number three, could there be a run on the banks? Question mark. Even if you don't understand what that question means, it'll become clear when I address it. Could there be a run on the banks? Number four, how is it that Republicans can pass an enormous stimulus package when under normal circumstances Republicans are conservative and suspicious about spending? I like that question. And number five, why are Americans so entrenched in their views on issues? Why are we Americans so entrenched, so attached, so unable to move away from our pre-existing views on issues, whether they're political or otherwise? All right, we're going to start with number one. I don't want to ramble. I just want to give you some of my thoughts on these, and then I want to hear your thoughts. Thank you, by the way, for keeping up with the questions I've submitted before. If I haven't submitted comments, I'm sorry, but I am in the process of doing that. In grading papers too. Number one, what are executive orders and what are the limits on their use and powers? Well, we have to go back to what are executive orders? Executive orders are something that are used by an executive, and they're an order. And they are sort of, although they're not used with that name, they are enabled that power is given in the Constitution. The Constitution, this isn't literal, but in Article 2, which has to do with what? No, Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 are the powers of the presidency. Power of the presidency. Article 2 gives the president the authority to use their discretion to determine how to enforce the law or manage the resources and staff of the executive branch. Okay, so basically, an executive order can and should be used to basically be that chief executive officer of that branch of the government and basically interpret or direct how particular laws or policies are administered or implemented. Interesting. It's interesting because executive orders have been in place, although not under that particular name, since George Washington. And every president has used executive orders, many of them, from, let's say, one or two from the early presidents to, I think, 3,500, Franklin Roosevelt. But many hundreds are given by the typical modern president. I will say that there is an exception. I think there's one president, William Henry Harrison, who basically croaked within a month after becoming president, who didn't issue an executive order. But that's the one glitch in the whole system. It is very much a part of presidents' jobs to issue these executive orders, and they do. And my question is actually prompted by the president's executive order of this past week, which limits, which actually has a 60-day delay on green cards issued to potential immigrants. But we'll get to that in a second. So how does the president use an executive order? And how are they checked? Well, first off, I should say they've been used for both good purposes and maybe not so good purposes. But the most important thing is, especially since it's U.S. government, is how this power of the president is checked. Because the concern is, if a president can basically issue something like, we're not going to issue green cards to immigrants, we are going to, I'm taking from maybe President Trump's most famous executive order to date, which is, we're going to ban immigration from the 7 majority Islamic nations early in his presidency, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court. How does he have the power to do that when it sounds like it is a legislative act? Okay, we've got the 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And the executive is supposed to administer the laws, the legislative is supposed to make laws, and the judicial is supposed to interpret the laws. Here we have a president, we have presidents, very much in the tradition of making determinations that look very much like laws. Well, I guess the first thing is, it has to be within their domain of their executive branch. And secondly, this always can be checked on the basic checks and balances, which were included in the Constitution of the United States. And it can be checked. First of all, unlike a law, an executive order can be canceled by any successive president. In fact, a typical act within the first couple weeks of a presidency is to strike off any executive orders issued by previous presidents that the current president doesn't agree to. So it's a law that, while an order can be made so easily by a president, all it has to be done is a president has to issue it, and then it is basically the law, quote unquote, of the land. But a successive president can go ahead and just wipe it off the books. So it's very easy to erase by a successive president. How can someone else limit it? Well, the president, in actually writing an executive order, can limit it himself or herself by putting a time limit on it. And the current executive order that was just written this week does have a 60-day time limit on it. For the next 60 days, we will not issue any green cards. We're going to eliminate any new immigration of people to this country. We'll talk about it specifically in a second. Also, it does have to be, it is liable to be checked through the courts. That is, the Supreme Court or any other court can rule on it and can determine it unconstitutional. So it has to conform with the Constitution. It cannot go above or beyond what the Constitution says is either the right of the president or the is the right of the president to do. So it is subject to, as they say, judicial review. Also, the legislative branch can basically nullify an executive order by creating a new law that nullifies it or that supersedes it. Of course, then would the president sign it? And if so, then if he wouldn't sign it, then they'd have to override that veto. But anyway, there are lots of ways in which an executive order is checked and limited. Let's let's talk about some specific executive orders. Executive orders have been used for both insignificant and very significant things. Insignificant, President George W. Bush basically put a limit on access to the archives of the private writings of presidents. No one really heard about that one, and it was actually revoked by President Obama when he took over. Okay, did anyone really hear about that? I don't know. But there's both an inconsequential one and one that was summarily revoked. But more important ones, both good and bad, have been issued. The Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves was issued by President Lincoln by executive order. President Truman tried to nationalize the steel industry during the Korean War during a steel strike. He thought, okay, we're going to have to end the strike somehow so that we can keep up steel production to supply our war needs. And so he decided that the federal government was going to take over the steel industry. And in a court decision, his executive order was revoked. It was superseded. So there is an executive order that was maybe a bad idea. Well, according to the court, it was unconstitutional for the president to take that much power. Other things that have been, we talked about the travel ban issued by President Trump. What else? Or a bad one was when President Roosevelt issued that the military can remove anyone from a military district. That's pretty general, but the military during World War II utilized that executive order to remove Japanese Americans from ordinary society and place them in internment camps. Something that was never revoked, as far as I know, or canceled, but which President Reagan in the 1980s sometime, basically apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans and paid any surviving people of internment camps like $20,000. Okay, what more did I want to say about this? Let's talk specifically about the president's current executive order. He initially tweeted that he was going to basically eliminate, or he was going to stay all immigration for the next 60 days in a tweet. And that, the tweets have been heavily criticized, but they're actually good ways to sort of get a quick read on what the public's reaction is going to be to any policy. And President Trump had been thinking about this, his administration had been thinking about this for, I think, weeks. And he was about ready to draft something, and he just sent that out. And the response to that did actually affect his administration's writing of the executive order, because when people heard that, he heard a big no to the idea that all immigrants of any kind would be restricted from coming into the country, specifically temporary workers. And apparently, people in the know say that it was the technology sector who employs a lot of temporary workers from overseas, as well as healthcare, as well as agriculture, let's say from Mexico and Central America. We rely on it a lot to basically make our economy run. So I think Trump basically scaled back this executive order, so it just limits green cards for permanent citizens to relocate here, and allowed temporary seasonal workers to come. So it very specifically, it only takes a sector of that. Interestingly, though, people who have communicated with the public have said that further restrictions on foreign workers is going to be likely. And this is just a first step in shrinking legal immigration. Now, why would the president issue something like this? He said in times of the COVID-19, it isn't, although he included that it was partly because of human health and the transference of disease, but without including all immigrants, it was sort of a strange thing to do. But really, and it's not hidden, and it's not hidden in the wording of the executive order, he did so because of the enormous effect that the COVID-19 has had on our economy, and that he didn't want to take away jobs permanently from U.S. Citizens. So that was primary in his thinking in doing this. And what it'll probably do is affect about 358,000 green card applicants in this period of time. This, of course, had an uproarious reception by uproarious in that it was negatively viewed by many immigration groups, as you can imagine, and applauded, although applauded by his base, although his base did say that probably he didn't go far enough in limiting immigration. So what do you think? Do you think he went too far? Do you think that executive orders are limited enough in how people use them? I don't know if I went over that well enough, but that's what I'm going to say for now. Let's go to question number 2. What was question number 2? Oh, does impeachment work like the Founding Fathers imagined? Impeachment. Okay, well, current events. Trump was impeached recently. That just means put on trial. Clinton, several administrations ago, and before that it wasn't until just after the Civil War with President Johnson who was impeached. Now, all 3 of those presidents were impeached. Were any convicted? No. And herein lies the rub. Is that Shakespearean? I don't know. I don't even know what it means. But this is the way that the Founding Fathers imagined impeachment. They thought that everyone, people in Congress, presidents, everyone would be very jealous of their power. And they would be very much on the lookout for people acting egregiously. That is, that if anyone were to be acting outside of the limits of their power, the other people in the government would be very quick to call them on it, and to basically say that, I'm sorry, but you're acting out of line with the way that the Constitution has framed your job or your responsibilities, and you are being irresponsible. That's well and good. And to make sure that it wasn't going to be just a popularity contest, the framers of the Constitution made sure that anyone who would be convicted needed to be convicted by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. Okay, brought to trial by the House of Representatives and then tried by the jury of the Senate. That's 100 people. And remember, the Senate is sort of the upper house in that they have longer terms and there are only 2 per state, and they're supposed to be the more august and removed from public opinion people that are supposed to be sort of the wiser statesmen as envisioned by the Founding Fathers, who would have used good and wise judgment as to whether someone was using power egregiously, incorrectly, or grossly committing high crimes and misdemeanors. Interestingly, the founders never imagined that it would be just that a president needed to be found guilty of violating a particular law. After all, when the whole thing was, the Constitution was written, there were no laws yet written that limited a president or anyone else. So it was just sort of egregious high crimes and misdemeanors, a very general statement. So no one needs to prove let's say, finding a president guilty, needs to find them guilty of violating a specific law of the U.S. But here is the big answer to it, and that is that when it was written, the framers of the Constitution did not foresee that party politics would be so important in American life. They did not like political parties. They didn't see them as controlling American politics. And so that is what really keeps impeachment from being an effective process. Because I don't care what case you're looking at, and I'm not looking at this from any partisan point of view. No matter what situation where any president has been brought out for impeachment, in the end, everyone who votes for it votes on party lines. Okay? So, so if the president is on trial and you are a Democratic senator, you are 99 out of 100 times going to vote against the president. If you're a Republican, you're going to vote on the side of the president. If a Democratic president is up for is being on trial for impeachment, the reverse is going to happen. People, whether it's President Johnson, President Clinton, or President Trump, the vote almost always goes right down party lines. In other words, people are not looking necessarily. I'm not speaking of any specific issues here, but I'm just looking at the results of how people vote. People are not voting based on their moral convictions about what their president does. They're voting based on their own party lines. I will say that with Johnson, this is right after President Lincoln, with Johnson's administration, it was basically the Democrats who were for him, because he was basically a Democrat from Tennessee. Nixon needed him on the ticket in 1864 because he thought he was going to lose, and he needed some popularity among those moderate border states. Anyway, so what is it that keeps that process from working? It's political parties, in that the vote is almost always going to go down party lines. Unfortunately, I wish we could break that lock on such solid party politics, but as we've talked about even last week about the two-party system, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Let's go on to number 3. We're going quickly. This is good. I like this. Put your thoughts into this as well. Oh, I think this is the easy one. This is is there going to be a run on the banks? What is a run on the banks? Well, could there be a run on the banks? A run on the banks is when people go and they take all their money because they believe that the banks are going to not be solvent. They're going to lose all the money because the economy is going downhill, and their money in the account will be disappear. This did happen. This happened in the Great Depression, and many people are comparing the current economic crisis to the Great Depression. But during the Great Depression, or at least in the initial stages of it, 1929, 1930, there were no guarantees that your money was insured in any way. And if the bank lost your money, well, oh no, your money was gone. But one of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt did, after he put the banks on holiday, which was say, whoa, let's close them until people settle down a little bit and we can get them on better ground. One of the first things he did was create the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, I think is what it is. And that is a federal insurance policy on your money in the bank. And whenever you go into a bank or savings and loan, it'll say it on the door, and a little sticker. Look for that. FDIC. That means your money is insured up to, I can't remember how much, $250,000? It's such a large amount that I don't have to worry about the maximum amount that it's insured. Could it not be insured? Yeah, I guess if the economy completely collapses and the government collapses, but if that happens, I think we'll have even bigger worries than our bank accounts. Number 4. How is it that Republicans can pass enormous stimulus packages when under normal circumstances they are conservative and suspicious about spending? This is really interesting because you look at any party debates, and one of the first things that conservatives are going to accuse Democrats of is being big government tax and spend advocates, and that's actually an issue that hits home with many American voters. We do not want huge government, we do not want huge tax increases, and we don't want government to take over our lives. So how could a Republican government of Trump's help to pass this stimulus package? Well, part of it is the age that we're in. even though we've had the Reagan Revolution, and that Trump is harkening back in large part to the conservative revolution that Reagan initiated. We also are a sum of all of our history, and our history has gone through a lot of different changes, and the government has increased in size. And many of these same issues were debated when Franklin Roosevelt created the New Deal, and later on, another Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, created the Great Society and created a lot of programs and a lot of deficit spending. Deficit spending meaning we're going to spend more money than we're going to bring in taxes this year. Okay? Now, where so basically, it's been done before, so in times of desperate need, we'll do it again. So interesting that a Republican-led government is doing it in a time when they ultimately have power. It needs to be passed by a Republican majority in the Senate, as well as the president. When previously it's thought of as just a Democratic thing. Well, it's partly because of the times, because it's so unusual, and the need seems so great for some sort of external stimulus to get the economy going, and our tradition of having done it before and survived it, that makes this acceptable, not only to Democrats but very much to Republicans, so that it receives widespread approval. I think the other thing is that the whole idea of deficit spending also has somewhat disappeared, in the fact that that even people like Reagan and George W. Bush have talked about supply side economics, in the sense that you can even cut taxes, and you can have a deficit, and the increase in job creation is going to offset whatever deficit you go into. Let me reframe this. Let me say that if there was debate in Congress over the stimulus package, it wasn't so much as to whether we would have it, but really who would be the recipients of the money. And the tendency of the Republicans was, it's going to go to business owners. It's going to go to job creators. And with Democrats saying, no, we wanted to go immediately to the people who are in the greatest need. And that really shows the two sides of our political system. The people who believe in the supply side economics, that is, that the job creators are, in the long run, going to create economic stability for this country. Whereas the Democrats are more concerned with who are in the greatest need, in the most immediate need, and are the, let's say, victims of our economic policies in this country. So there you have my quick and easy answer to that. I have a lot more to say about that, but I'm not going to here. And number 5, why are Americans so entrenched in their views on issues? Oh, this is huge. I don't know what brings this issue up with me. I guess in part, I think because of how entrenched people are politically, whether they're Bernie supporters or moderate Democrats or Trump supporters or libertarians, and they won't move a budge an inch from their particular point of view on any issue. That's a little bit frustrating. Hey, I point the finger at myself too. I can identify with a certain issue and a certain viewpoint, and it's tough for me to budge. Well, I asked myself in the last couple of days, why is it that we are so slow to budge? And this is the answer I came up with myself. Part of it is we identify with our own tribe. By tribe, I mean people who we basically consider as sort of our allies, or the people that we look at as seeing life correctly. And it could be our parents, it could be our brothers and sisters, it could be our friends, it could be our socioeconomic group, it could be people we hang out with, it could be people we likened to, who are famous, whatever. That's our tribe. And if a tribe has a particular view on something, then we're going to tend to follow that because we are social animals. Okay, some people may not think we're animals, but you know what I mean. We're social, and we want to be like those that we are like. The other thing is that the more that we associate with a tribe, I think the more we are consistently bombarded by that tribe's message. Okay, and by this I mean even the media that we watch, the books that we read, the the people we follow on social media, the whatever, the conversations we have, the people we keep away from in conversation, and the people we encourage conversations with. All of these help to reinforce our opinions so that our pre-existing ideas are only reaffirmed by all that information we're getting, because we know, you can't deny this, that the different sources of information, whether they're people or media or books or whatever, are coming from a particular point of view. There really is no objectivity oftentimes. It's always has very much a particular perspective and agenda that goes along with it. And so we're gonna buy those books and those magazines, and we're gonna watch those channels, and we're gonna subscribe to those particular things that align with our preconceived notions about how we see something. And that's only gonna strengthen and solidify our opinions about things. The third thing I wrote down about this is that, changing would make us have to look really long and hard at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, I'm wrong about something. And that's hard for us to do. It's hard for me to do, and it's hard for you to do. It's hard for all of us to do. And the last of these is that changing our opinion requires work. And if we're comfortable in the way that we view the world, why would we work to change that which we are so sure is the correct way to view the world? Anyway, those are some thoughts I have. And I'm going to end on something that I wrote down that's a paraphrase of something written or said, I can't remember what. It's a quotation from a former Treasury Secretary who just died last week. His name is Paul O'Neill. He worked in the Bush administration. He left the Bush administration early because he actually disagreed with their second. He agreed with the first tax cut. He was quite fiscally conservative, and he disagreed with the second tax cut made by the younger Bush, George W. Bush, with his second tax cut. But if you look on your dollar bills, many of them will still say Paul O'Neill on them. Anyway, this is taking from him, but not a direct quotation. But I think it operates in this conversation about our viewpoint on things. So I want you to take it seriously. Operating solely on our ideology is easy because we think that we already know everything. Therefore, we don't have to ask questions because we already have all the answers we need. Our minds cannot be penetrable by fact or by alternative ideas in that case. In the end, it's a sort of self-indoctrination that eventually becomes absolutist, which can never, ever change. Well, I hope that you are not absolutist and that you are capable of change. I hope that I am capable of change, because you know what? Times, they are a-changin'. Hey, answer these questions. I look forward to your answers, and I will see you this time, this day, next week. Thanks.